Welcome back to my channel for a short Hasselblad episode. And I will do this episode with my X2D Mark II here and my currently most favorite zoom lens on the Hasselblad, the 35-100E XCD lens. I also have Stephanie here in the studio because this video is about flash photography, and the background for this video is the following. It's actually very simple. I always read in comments complaints about Hasselblad and compatibility with flashes. I never had any issues shooting with flash on a Hasselblad X1D Mark II or X2D or now on the X2D Mark II. And in this video, I want to show one example, one setup with a Profoto Flash here actually in front of me on the table. We'll shoot Stephanie. I will show you a couple of settings which will help to make your flash photography a success. Let's kick this off. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, please do so. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, support my work. For you, it's for free. For me, it means the world. Many thanks for that. Okay, so maybe one reason why the Hasselblad X2D is a bit more tricky with flash photography is because there is no dedicated hot shoot technique from Hasselblad, and you will not find, if you Google flash for Hasselblad, anything in the web. The reason is that the hot shoe of the Hasselblad X2D cameras is actually compatible with Nikon hot shoes. And that's why I never had any issues shooting, for instance, a Nikon speedlight on the Hasselblad X2D or X1D Mark II. And it's exactly the same on the X2D Mark II. Now the flash I want to use in this video here is a Profoto Flash and is currently my flash to go to. I was just doing a shooting for sports outside in the field, and I used this flash here, which is the Profoto A2. And I also had a softbox, a diffuser mounted, which I'm going to show in the course of the video. And it was absolutely flawless, absolutely no problem. I don't know where all the complaints come from saying that Hasselblad X2D cameras or now the Mark II are so tricky with flash. I really don't know, because it works like a charm, and I'll prove it to you in this video. Now this flash is basically a flash which you shoot remotely. You don't see any mount here for the hot shoe of the camera. And the way you trigger this is with a transmitter, which is here in this fancy little box. And it looks like this. And this is what you actually mount on the hot shoe. It also locks in. And then you make sure that the channels are in sync on the flashes. And then you can trust the automatic light metering system on the camera in a TTL logic to actually get you the right exposure. It's very, very simple. And of course, you can do manual overrides and can make this stronger or less elevated, what have you. But it actually works in a very flawless way, which I'm going to show you in this video. If you shoot people, you actually want to have diffuse light. And there are a couple of things you can do here in this setup. If you look here in the background at the Profoto A2 and my Hasselblad X2D Mark II, with the 35-100E. And the first one is you can clip on one of these diffusion domes. And Stephanie, can you clip this on and show people how this looks like, please? You see? Simple like that. It's magnetic, it snaps on. And if you want to remove it, you just take it off with a little bit of force. But the accessory I use most of the time for mobile shooting is actually the Click softbox, which Stephanie has now in her hands. Comes in a pouch. It's the smallest one available for the Profoto A2. And Stephanie, let's take it out and let's clip it and mount it on the Profoto A2. Can you go a little more to this direction? Perfect. Look at that, how it folds, and then it sits firmly. You see, it gets the light very diffuse, and then you clip it on in the same way as the little dome before. It just snaps on. Perfect. Looks really good. Let's get this off again. And then you also have here a little grip, and you see how Stephanie can hold this. So with one hand, let's say with my left hand, I can hold this in the field and can enlighten the scene in front of the camera. And in the right-hand side, I can shoot with the Hasselblad X2D Mark II and the lens I'm keen of shooting in this particular situation. Simple like that. All right, so I kindly asked Stephanie to make space here for Jennifer in the background. because before we are going to shoot Stephanie with Flash here with the Profoto A2, I want to make a couple of remarks and show you a little bit how that combination works. So the transmitter here is now mounted on the hot shoe of the camera. And you see it here, it's up and running. We are in group A and we are on channel 1. The same is true for the Flash here. It's channel 1 and group A. And this is all wired up now. And it's very important, by the way, if you have accessories for the Hasselblad X2D II, which you want to fully leverage, you better make sure that the newest firmware is on these accessories. So I use the app, which is on my iPhone, the Profoto Connect app, to actually update the firmware of the Profoto A2 and also of the Profoto Connect Pro. And in this way, I make sure that newer gear like the Hasselblad X2D II is still a pretty new camera, will really communicate in a proper way with these accessories. I'm shooting with my 35-100 lens on the X2D II, and I have here face detection activated. You see that works pretty well on Jennifer here, although she's not even a human being. I'm on autofocus continuous and I have face detection switched on. I want to shoot widest open at 100mm, which is an f4. And I can take a shot. And before, let's test if this all really works. So I can do a test flash here by pushing that button. Let's see if you see the light flashing in the filming camera. I'm not sure you have seen this. Let me show you from the side. You see? So the flash is really working. I pointed towards Jennifer here. And we have about a little less than a meter of distance here. So this is pretty nice and handy. There's one more setting I want to change here. Namely, I want to shoot at the base ISO. And let's tap the ISO button. Let's go here to an ISO of 50. That's the native or base ISO of the X2D II. And I also want to quickly show the flash menu here. So there is a dedicated menu here. It's called Flash, of course. And it's really Spartanic. There are not many settings. There is not like in Nikon or Canon or Sony cameras a lot to do here where you can activate or deactivate TTL and all of that. I'm coming back to TTL in a moment. There is just sync, there is normal, and there is rear. Since we are not shooting with any movement effects here, we are shooting normal. We don't need rear. The difference is here it's flashing at the beginning of exposure. Here it's flashing at the end of exposure. And I keep this on normal here. And then there is a second setting which is currently activated. I can deactivate it or activate it. And that is essentially only doing the following. If the flash is charging after flashing before and is not ready yet, then exposure will be locked in a way that you cannot fire the shot. And that prevents you from taking shots where at the very end the flash was not ready and not enlightening the scene. And the camera is helping you to prevent that. That's basically all. I recommend to leave this for almost all shooting situations at normal and exposure lock until flash ready to be activated. Let me now show you and demonstrate live a few things which are important to understand and which are totally confusing for newbies in flash photography on Hasselblad X cameras. And the first one is there is an auto button here. And if I push it, it goes into manual mode. It recognizes only one flash, namely the Profoto A2 here, and I can steer here the intensity of the flash if I want. If I push the auto button again, it says auto here at the top line of the display. And that's basically the TTL mode for the Hasselblad X2D II here. I've now changed the setup slightly here. I've moved the Profoto A2 out to the right-hand side so that you can just see the display and the flash. And I have also placed a book with a little bit of a glossy cover behind Jennifer. So you might get a better indication in terms of reflections, whether the flash has been triggered, and also have a little bit of a feeling what the intensity is. And it's, by the way, a beautiful book. It's from Annie Leibovitz, one of the most famous contemporary photographers. And it's a book about portraits of women. Very nice book. So let's use the test button here and quickly trigger the flash to see if you get any reflections in that glossy book cover here. Yes, you saw it flashing, and that's good. So we are ready to take a shot of Jennifer here. And I, by the way, switched here now to continuous autofocus since the face is nicely recognized here of Jennifer. And let's now take a shot here. Let's focus. It found the eye and boom. You see here on the reflection on the book cover, that's the tricky part. The flash has been fired. If we go into the preview mode, we have sufficient exposure on Jennifer's face, sharp, crisp, nice, the way we know Jennifer in all those videos on my channel. Let's quickly talk about flash intensities here. So by metering light through the lens in this shot we just took, the camera figured out and transmitted to the Profoto A2 that a 3.5 intensity is appropriate, and the flash was obedient and actually fired with that intensity. Now we have here a scale. If I go here down to the very end, it starts at 0.1 and it ends at 10. Have a look here. This is 10, then it makes a beep. End of story. I cannot go any further. So the intensities play between 0.1, which is barely anything, and the maximum intensity is a 10. Now, the camera figured out a 3.5, and it's important to note for these type of intensity scales that they are logarithmic. And that means the following: if I change the intensity by manual override from 3.5 to 3.0, I have reduced the light intensity by half a stop. If I increase from 3.0 to 4.0, I have basically doubled the intensity, which means I increased by one full stop. So that's very important to bear in mind. If I move from one value, let's say 5 to 6, I have actually increased the intensity by one full stop, which means I doubled the light from 5.0 to 6.0. And if I go back by just half a stop, ending at 5.5, you need to apply the square root of 2 rule to actually find that this is about a 29% decrease in light intensity here. What I want to do next is picking up on those comments where people say TTL is never correctly working with the Hasselblad X cameras and whatever flash I'm taking, as long as it is Nikon compatible, which are the only flashes that work on the hot shoe and that also work in this remote triggering setup here. But I want to show you that it really works. And in order to do that, I want to change on the camera my shooting parameters and then show you live in a demonstration how the intensity is adapting to whether the scene needs more light or less light. But before doing that, let's quickly talk about that intensity again. Let me manually dial in here the double value. Let's go to 7. Here we go. And let me actually meter light here by half pressing the shutter button. You see it's Jennifer's eye which is found. The focus field is green, but the intensity is not updating. Let me hold the camera differently so you can see this live. Look, I half press the shutter button. I get focus confirmation via the green square here or rectangle, but the intensity is not updating back to the 3.5. So what is going on here? And the way to understand this is the following. Think about actually 2 flashes being fired by that Profoto A2. There is a very quick pre-flash before exposure is finally taken, and that pre-flash is used to communicate with the transmitter, and the transmitter communicates with the camera to get the intensity right. And you will see this immediately. The moment in time I release the shot via the shutter release button, the intensity will jump back to 3.5. Let's have a look. I wanted to show you this, and that also hopefully reduces some of the confusion which is out there. Let's focus, half press the shutter button. Let's take the shot. Boom, and intensity is back at 3.5. You see it? That's the way it works. There are 2 flashes which are fired, a pre-flash for measuring, and then the final flash, which actually comes in line at the beginning of taking exposure, because we have here in the menu in the flash setup, we have actually chosen normal and we have not chosen rear, right? That's the way it works. All right, what I want to do now is playing with exposure parameters here and tweaking them in one or the other direction and showing you live how the intensity is updating on the flash, but after I took the shot. You will not see it before because of that 2 flash concept, which I just explained, a pre-flash and then a main flash. And my problem now here is not a problem. We can solve it in a moment, of course. The problem is if I now, let's go back to widest open f4, and we have here 1/8, depending on where I point here. We have here aperture priority and the shutter speed is figured out by the camera. The moment in time I would stop down now, you see how the shutter speed is adapting. I've also image stabilization activated here. So this will lead to nothing. That means I will now dial in exposure as figured out by aperture priority in the manual mode. And let's quickly half press the shutter button and read off the parameters. So we have 1/10 seconds and we have an f4. Let's now switch into fully manual mode here and let's dial in the correct values. So we have an f4 confirmed, of course, but the shutter speed needs to become much quicker to 1/10 seconds. Here we go. And now let's fire the shot. Let's see if this still works. Also, if the camera is in manual mode. Yes, you see the flash was triggered and we have correct exposure. All right, now I want to play a little bit with parameters here and see how the intensity of the flash is reacting, because if there is a TTL thing going on in the background, the camera actually should make the flash changing intensity the moment in time I touch the shooting parameters. And when I said very sloppy at the beginning, I never had any issues with flash on Hasselblad X cameras. That's true for the more recent past. It's not so true for some years back. I really had to learn my lessons. And that's why I want to make some points here which might help you for your shooting if you get frustrated the moment in time you connect the flash to your camera, be it on the hot shoe or be it via a transmitter like here in this setup. I changed a couple of settings here. I'm still at widest open f4 at the 100mm tele setting on the lens, based on native ISO of 50 and 1/10 seconds. And we already saw, if we look at the right-hand side, this always required an intensity of 3.5 on the A2 flash. But I also use a self-timer here of 2 seconds. And that means I'm no longer allowed to use autofocus continuous. And if I go here, you see this is grayed out. Let me quickly show you how this works. If I deactivate the self-timer, I can actually go back to autofocus continuous. But if I activate the self-timer again with 2 seconds, autofocus continuous will get grayed out, which makes perfectly sense if you use a self-timer, and it automatically switches to AFS, so single autofocus. That's the setup we have here. What I also want to do is I want to have it simple on the focus side. If it is autofocus single anyway, let's also get the subject detection off. And then we get here this green square on Jennifer's face if it found focus. And now I want to fire a shot to see if the 3.5 is consistently staying at that value. So let's get this done. Self-timer. Boom. Flash triggered. You see it here on the reflections. And the intensity is still a 3.5. So that's a good anchor point to actually start our discussion and our analysis. And by the way, I would probably correct here Jennifer's face a little bit. It's sharp and crisp, but I think it's a little bit overblown, right? So let's play a little bit with parameters. And the first thing I want to do, which will totally confuse everyone who is seeing this, is I want to take a full stop down here on the aperture. So let's go from f4 to an f5.6. Here we go. And you see, by the way, on the metering indication here on the scale, we went at an f4.0, we were at plus 0.1. And then if we go to f5.6, we are at minus 0.9. There is exactly one full stop sitting in between. What I would now expect after everything I told you about intensities, when we said that one full stop up is actually 1 point up. So I would expect if I go down here by one full stop from f4 to f5.6, I see on the intensity an increase from 3.5 to 4.5. But unfortunately, that's not what will happen. So let's fire the shot. Self-timer here. It stays at 3.5. You see that? How disappointing is that? But now is not the time to give up. We will use the experience we just made, namely that no matter whether we have an f4 here or one full stop darker f5.6, the TTL algorithm of the X2D Mark II dictates the same intensity to the flash by the transmitter, namely a 3.5. We'll use this to understand how Hasselblad actually implemented the TTL algorithm. And in my experience over the years when using flash on the Hasselblad, I discovered that there are two underlying factors which Hasselblad cameras take into account when they try to figure out what is the correct intensity I need to send via the transmitter to the flash. And the first factor is the outcome of the metering and measurement from the pre-flash. We talked about that before. The Profoto A2 fires two flashes. One is a pre-flash for metering and measurement, and the second is the main flash, which, by the way, happens at the beginning of exposure. Based on what I showed you here, we have sync at normal. And by the way, that measurement based on the pre-flash is very much driven by the bright color of Jennifer's face, because the metering methods we have here on the X-system cameras is center weighted spot and center spot. And since the focus field is sitting on Jennifer's face, this is more or less all dominated by the bright color of her face. And if you actually look at the two images, let's shoot them again. Let's go here to an f4. Let's take a shot. 3.5 intensity, you see it here. Let's stop down, make this one full stop darker. Let's take another shot. And let's look at these two images. Still intensity 3.5. Look, this is a repeatable experiment. And if we look here, let's bring up the metadata. We have here the f5.6. And if you look here at Jennifer's face, it's actually almost in the same brightness as on the f4 shot. The f4 shot is a little bit brighter, but clearly the measurement taking place by the pre-flash is here very much dominated by the bright color of Jennifer's face. Now, the second factor which Hasselblad cameras take into account when figuring out what intensity to send to the flash is actually the ambient light. And the ambient light here in this room is super dominant. It's actually so dominant that it doesn't move the needle at all what the pre-flash, as driver 1, is measuring and providing as an outcome to the camera. And that is something I can easily demonstrate to you now. I will just take away the dominance of the ambient light. So let's switch off the light on the ceiling. Let's go to my daylight LEDs, which sit above my filming table here. And let's dim it down. Let's dim it down. And watch now what happens. Let me repeat what I indicated before. The ambient light before was super dominant, and whatever the pre-flash was measuring, metering, didn't move the needle. Now I completely took away the dominance of the ambient light, and now all of a sudden the pre-flash will become the dominant driver in its measurement and outcome for what the camera will send as intensity to the flash. Have a look. Self-timer again. Boom, it jumped up to 4.7. You see that? And Jennifer's face actually has nice exposure. Have a look here. This is pretty nice, right? Who would have thought that a flash on a Hasselblad camera produces such a nice light on a face? Look at that. Very, very nice. And it jumped up to 4.7 from 3.5. If I now come back with a little bit of dominance on ambient light, we should actually be able to interpolate between the 3.5 and the 4.7. Let's have a look what happens if I get a little bit less dimming here on my daylight LEDs and fire another shot. Now we're at 3.8. We are getting close to the 3.5 we had before, but we have a value between these two values, the 3.5 and the 4.x value we had before. Let me also get the light on the ceiling switched on again. So that's, I think, the first very important takeaway here in this exercise. Hasselblad X cameras, they are driven by two factors: outcome of the measurement and metering from the pre-flash, but also by the ambient light. And if one of these factors is more dominant, it will play a role in the way how the intensity is figured out by the camera and sent to the flash. Let's now systematically test the connection between the camera and the flash and how the camera, let's call it Hasselblad's TTL logic, is updating that intensity, which currently for these parameters, which we saw a couple of times now, f4, 1/10 seconds, base ISO of 50, is dialing in at 3.5. And in order to do that, I want to focus once on Jennifer, and then I want to switch, since I have found focus here, to manual focus. So nothing changes here any longer. Let's take one shot. Let's see if this is sharp and in focus, and we don't touch focus anymore in what's about to come. And I think that looks good. Jennifer's face is sharp and in focus. What I also want to do is I want to go to a manual white balance setting here, not auto white balance. And I don't know what is it here. Let's call it daylight. Let's have a look how this looks like. I think that's fine. Let's keep it at daylight. And so we have fixed any influence coming from tiny little adjustments of focus or white balance. So this is now kept constant and will not change throughout the test series I'm going to shoot. Let's also bear in mind and remember what I said before on intensities here. So one full point here refers to one full stop, right? I explained this earlier in the video. This is something we need to be conscious about now. And let's now go and let's change ISO by one full stop towards a brighter scene. You see it here updating in live view immediately. Watch what happens to the intensity. Let me take the shot from here so you can see how this is updating. Self-timer, it jumps to 2.5. Totally consistent, in line with what we expect. We made the scene one full stop brighter, and the flash reduces flash intensity by one full stop. Let's do this once more. Let's go here to ISO. Let's go to an ISO of 200. And we don't care that this is overexposed now here on the camera. I just want to test the connection between the camera and the flash. Let's take that shot. Let me shoot in this way again so you see the intensity immediately. And I can tell you already right now, it will jump from 2.5 to 1.5, which is again compensating for another full stop higher in brightness. Let's take the shot. 1.5. Let's do it once more, just to be on the safe side. Let's go to an ISO of 400. Let's take the shot. We'll be in 0.5 now. See, there's finally some consistency we see in the random testing we did before. That looks actually as if the camera TTL logic would trigger at the flash what we expect. If we make exposure one full stop brighter on ISO, it actually adjusts the intensity by one full stop towards lower flash exposure. All right, that's already good. I went back to the original exposure, correct exposure, f4, 1/10 seconds, ISO of 50. Let's now make it brighter by means of shutter speed. Let's see what happens. First of all, let's take a shot so we get here back to the famous 3.5. Self-timer. Boom, here we are, 3.5. It's all repeatable, replicable. That works, reliable wiring up between the camera body via the transmitter and the flash here, the Profoto A2. Now let's start another test series. Let's go here to shutter speed, and if we have 1/10 seconds for correct exposure, one full stop overexposure on shutter speed would be 1/5 seconds, which is 0.2 seconds, right? So let's go to 0.2 seconds. And watch the intensity at 3.5, the famous 3.5. It will not change, which brings me a bit closer to the points I want to make and what I really want to carve out here at the essential so you understand what's going on. Let's continue. So 1/5 seconds is 0.2 seconds. One full stop brighter is 0.4 seconds. Let's go here to 0.4 seconds. Totally overexposed. But we don't care. We just test intensities here. No change in intensity. Let's do it once more. So we have 0.4 seconds here. Let's go to 0.8 seconds, getting close to 1 second. Let's take another shot. Watch the intensity. Totally overexposed. But as I said, we don't care. Taking the shot. No change in intensity. Oh my gosh, I'm so happy that this worked in the way I wanted it to work, because if it would have failed me now, my whole theory would have broken down. Let's go back to correct exposure. Correct exposure is 1/10 seconds. Let's go here to 1/10. The intensity will stay at the 3.5. It stayed there for a bunch of shots now. And now let's go to the third parameter in the triangle, the aperture. And since I'm here already on widest open at 100 millimeter, let's go in the other direction this time. Let's see if we can get any sensitivity of the flash intensity based on what we change in the light triangle here. So this is correct exposure. If we want to stop down by one full stop, this is an f5.6. Let's go there. No change here in the intensity. Let's go further. Next one, I think, is an f8. No change in intensity. Let's go even further. What is the next one? Is it an f11? I think so. Now the intensity jumped and all of a sudden compensated from 3.5 to 7.1. Now, we are going to interpret in a moment what we just saw and experienced in the series of test shots. What I want to do now is I want to increase ISO. So I want to go here one full stop higher, another full stop higher, another full stop higher to an ISO of 400. You see how the live view here is updating. We are hopelessly overexposed now. And there is a big difference between the base ISO and ISO between, let's call it in a range 200 to 400. And we are going to explore this now. Let's compensate for this via aperture. So we need to go 3 full stops down. So we go to an f5.6, an f8, and then an f11. And now we should have the same exposure in the preview, and we have. And now let's take a shot and see what the anchor point is on the intensity here. Let me do this with my left hand again. Let's fire the shot. And you see we are now at a 4.1. We just note it down because I want to continue my series now. Let's now make the whole scene brighter by going from 1/10 to 1/5 seconds. And we had these parameters from shutter speed before. You see the preview updating here. Let's take a shot. And the intensity jumps from 4.1 to 1.8. Let's do this again. One more stop here is 0.4 seconds. Intensity will jump again. Watch it to 0.5. Let's do it again to 0.8 seconds. And it will jump no more. Let's repeat the shot. No more jumps. Let's go back to the correct exposure. That was 1/10 seconds. We'll hopefully see this jumping back to the intensity we saw before, 4.1. Here we go. It's a 4.1. All right, now let's make this darker. One full stop is 1/20. 4.6. One more full stop is 1/40. 4.8. One more stop is 1/80 seconds. 4.9, I guess. Yes, here we go. All right, we interpret this all later. Be a little bit patient. Stay with me in this analysis. Okay, so I'm back at correct exposure here. You remember f11, 1/10 seconds, ISO 400, so much higher than the base ISO. Fired the camera once, so we are back at our anchor intensity of 4.1. Now let's get the aperture wider and in this way overexpose. So let's go here to an f8. This is one full stop. Let me shoot. Watch the intensity. This will jump now to 1.0. Okay. Let's do this one more stop. f5.6. Watch the intensity. 0.5. Let's go to f4.0. And the intensity stays at 0.5. Last test series before interpretation I want to shoot is ISO. I'm back at the correct exposure here, f11, 1/10 seconds, ISO 400. The intensity is back at 4.1. Now let's go to an intensity one full stop darker, which is a 200. Take a shot. 5.1. That's actually fully consistent without any need to interpret. We made it one stop darker on the ISO and it compensated here by one full stop on the intensity. Let's go on ISO one more. Sorry, wrong direction. ISO 100 is another full stop darker. Watch the intensity. Is a 6.1, totally consistent with what we expect. And let's go to a last ISO value here, namely the base ISO 50. One full stop darker. Watch the intensity. 7.1. So this is fully consistent. Let's note it down. We have now 6 series of test shots, 6 outcomes, 6 tables. I'm going to walk you through very quickly in a moment. All right, here are the 6 tables from the 6 measurement series we took. And let's start with the 2 very straightforward tables, namely the ones where we changed ISO. In the upper left-hand side table, we made it brighter, and in the lower right-hand side table, we made it darker. And if we look at that, we have a very consistent, beautiful textbook-like behavior in both test series. Let's go to the upper left-hand side table first. We made ISO consistently one full stop brighter from 50 to 100 to 200 to 400, and the flash intensity compensated exactly in the way we would expect it if we take into account what I repeatedly say now, that one full point is corresponding to one full stop. And we have the same in the lower right-hand side table, where we made ISO consecutively darker, 400, 200, 150, and the flash intensity increased consistently in a linear way, in the way we expected. Here I was at an f4 in the upper left-hand side corner and at an f11 in the lower right-hand side corner. Here I stopped down further to f16, and then I took two test series, one where I made ISO darker from 1600 to 800 to 400 to 200, always one full stop, and then I made it starting from 1600 brighter to 3.2K, 6.4K, and 12.8K. And also here we see with minor deviations an almost always beautifully linear reaction of the flash intensity to changes in brightness based on ISO. For each stop darker on ISO, the flash intensity compensates by about one full stop higher. And for each stop brighter on ISO, the flash intensity compensates by about one full stop darker. So we can conclude here, and already worked away 2 of the 6 tables, relative changes in ISO lead to immediate changes in flash intensity in exactly the compensating way we expect. As much as we like the consistency I just presented to you, we see here that although in all 4 tables we have parameter settings which lead to the exactly same exposure value or EV, the flash intensity is nevertheless different in all 3 parameter sets and is 3.5, 4.1 and 4.2. So the same exposure value set on the camera does not necessarily trigger the same flash intensity. And that's something we need to bear in mind. All right, we started with 6 tables, 2 tables we worked our way through. It's the first table and table number 6 here in this presentation. So we can actually remove them from the pile of work we have to do. And for those 4 tables, let's now look at how the X2D Mark II drives the flash intensity when aperture shutter speed shifts. And we do this all again, and you remember what I did. You watched me live shooting these images. We do this all in auto or TTL mode. And we'll bear in mind that ISO shifts gave us pure linear mathematics in exactly the way we expected, in a compensating way we expected. With all the other parameters, unfortunately, in the light triangle, it won't be as straightforward. So buckle up, we are picking the first table and starting to discuss. All right, let's work away another table, and that's the one where we saw no change at all in flash intensity, although we were in 3 steps making exposure brighter by a slower shutter speed from 1/10 to 1/5 to 0.4 seconds and 0.8 seconds. And the observation was that the flash intensity stayed locked at 3.5 across all these shutter speeds. And the interpretation now is the following: the shutter speed affects ambient light only, not the flash exposure. And the camera measures that the ambient light change doesn't cross the threshold where dominance would shift from ambient light to flash light, and the camera's TTL logic decides therefore to keep the flash, let's call it a fill flash, constant, although ambient light changed significantly. And in conclusion here, and I'm going a bit deeper in a moment, TTL ignores shutter speed changes as long as ambient light dominates. And we saw this live in the studio when I switched off, or basically dimmed down, the light in the studio. It's managing, and now there is a new word here which I want to introduce, the flash to ambient ratio, not recalculating exposure for every shot. Now, what is that flash to ambient ratio? And let's go deeper here. Let's understand what this is all about. And the flash to ambient ratio describes how much of the total exposure as measured by the camera comes from flashlight versus ambient light. And it's a simple ratio. We have it here denoted with the Greek letter rho, and it's the ratio where we have E flash divided by E ambient, and you can think of E as illuminance or exposure energy from a light source here. And E flash is coming from the light source, which is the flash, and E ambient is coming from the light in the environment, in our case in the studio. And the TTL logic in the way we saw it is fully based on the flash to ambient ratio. So this ratio here, And you could call it the target ratio which the TTL logic aims to balance. So the interpretation is actually straightforward. If you have a high ratio, then the flash dominates and we get this typical flash-driven look, clean shadows, crisp edges, sharp image. If we have a low ratio, then the ambient light dominates and we get a natural light look, softer contrast, and so on. And if the ratio is kind of balanced, both light sources contribute roughly equally. If we look into the TTL system here, and we discussed this several times now, the camera fires on the flash a pre-flash and measures the total light passing through the lens onto the sensor and of course into the light metering system of the camera. So we have the light coming from the ambient light and the flashlight, and it gets caught up by the camera and measured. And the camera then receives it and reads and interprets the total light, which I denote here by the capital letter E, as E pre-flash plus E ambient. And of course the camera also, in the way we know it if we would not operate a flash at all, also measures the E ambient standalone. And as a consequence, the camera can figure out what is the flash contribution. So E pre-flash is the total light the camera is measuring minus E ambient. And given the bright ambient light in the studio, as we saw it before, when that intensity did not change at all, although we made the scene permanently brighter by basically going one full stop slower on shutter speed, the TTL logic realizes that the flash to ambient ratio is very small and therefore the camera just ignores it and doesn't change the intensity. So if we look at the table again and see how the shutter speed gets slower and slower, and therefore we saw that in the live view of the camera, the scene gets brighter and brighter, we actually make in the formula in the lower right hand side corner, which I did draw a box around it, we make the flash to ambient ratio even smaller because E ambient is in the denominator here. And if it becomes bigger, E ambient, by a slower shutter speed, the ratio becomes smaller. And therefore the camera even more ignores it. And manually increasing ambient light dominance by a slower shutter speed, for instance, makes the pre-flash contribution even smaller, and therefore we don't see any flash intensity changes in that particular shooting situation. And by the way, we saw this in the live experiment when I dimmed down the ambient light in the studio. All of a sudden the situation changed and the flash intensity jumped significantly from 3.5 to 4.7. I think this makes everything we saw in the live experiment very clear, and we can actually move on to table number 4. So the upper right hand side table, we worked away with everything I just explained, and we can drop it here. And then on this list we have 3 remaining tables, and table number 4 I want to discuss is actually this one here, because that seems to almost contradict what we experienced before at an ISO of 50 and what I just explained in a way that the flash to ambient ratio becomes even smaller if we make shutter speed slower, because here all of a sudden the flash intensity reacted when we repeated the whole shooting series at an ISO of 400 instead of at the base ISO of 50. So let's have a look into that and let's see what other conclusions we can draw from that live experiment. So here in this table we see that at an ISO of 400 all of a sudden the flash intensity sharply reacts to shutter speed changes, and it drops from 4.1 to 0.5 and then stays at a floor of 0.5 flash intensity. Let's go into the interpretation. So slower shutter speeds bring in much more ambient light, and the emphasis here really is on ambient. And once the camera sees enough ambient light to hit its exposure target within that TTL algorithm, which is implemented in the Hasselblad X2D II, it cuts flash dramatically. And the floor at a flash intensity of 0.5 is actually a camera imposed TTL command floor. It's the lowest flash power the X2D II will request in TTL mode or in auto mode, as we saw before, which is the same for this particular constellation. And although the Profoto A2's hardware can actually go as low as 0.1, as I showed you in the section on the logarithmic scale of intensities here, the Hasselblad camera never asks it to go that far. It stops issuing weaker power commands once the pre-flash measurements become unreliable. And in conclusion, and we go in a moment deeper again, as we did before on the previous table, when ambient light steeply climbs, TTL fades the flash down until it hits the X2D II imposed TTL floor, which is a flash intensity of 0.5, although the Profoto A2's actual hardware floor is in 0.1. Now, if we compare the last two tables, which we worked our way through now, found to the observations we made, correct interpretations, there is kind of almost a contradiction between these two, right? On the ISO 50 table on the left-hand side, we basically did not see any reactions to flash intensity, and we basically justified it with the flash to ambient ratio. And we made that very clear, and I think we all bought into that idea. But now if we change from ISO 50 to ISO 400, why do we all of a sudden these sharp declines in flash intensity if we do with the shutter speed the same in both tables? Namely, we make it slower and slower and exposure longer and longer. And I want to quickly comment on that because there is more underlying than we think from just staring at it for a moment. And I want to introduce quickly the notion of a dual gain sensor, which is highly likely, I'm almost certain, what we find in the Hasselblad X2D II. And low gain typically is a regime which occurs around base and native ISO, which here for the Hasselblad X2D II is an ISO of 50. And high gain is a regime which occurs at higher ISO. And if we want to be more precise, what gain means, it refers to analog amplification, means how much the tiny voltage coming from each pixel's collected charge is boosted before digitization via the analog digital converter, or acronymed ADC. So dual gain literally means the sensor has two analog gain circuits. One low gain path for bright scenes and one high gain path for dim scenes where you can achieve cleaner shadows. And at base ISO, there's essentially no meaningful amplification yet. The sensor output is fed almost directly into the analog digital converter. And here's an illustration how this looks like. We have on the x-axis here ISO values in increasing direction, and we have read noise in terms of electrons on the vertical axis. And you see that jump occurs somewhere around an ISO of 200, and until then, around 50 to 100 in terms of ISO, it's in low gain mode, and then it switches into high gain mode. And that is just an illustration, but if we look at a chart for the Hasselblad X2D, and that's a chart from photons2photos.net, we see exactly the same picture. Look at that. This is measured by the guys from Photons2Photos for the Hasselblad X2D. And the sensor in the Hasselblad X2D II and the X2D, they are kind of the same. They only drop the base ISO from 64 to 50, but otherwise I'm highly convinced that this is exactly the same sensor, except a little bit of tweaking here and there. So this chart, which is not yet available for the Hasselblad X2D II, very likely will also materialize for the Mark II version compared to the Hasselblad X2D. And we see that steep drop here between ISO 100 and ISO 200, which marks, in the meaning of what we saw before in that illustration, the gain switch point. And the read noise falls by more than one full stop here, which is a classic fingerprint of a dual conversion gain sensor, which is acronymed DZG. And beyond ISO 200, you see the read noise stays almost flat, which confirms a stable high gain mode. And I'm very, very sure that since we have this chart available from the Hasselblad X2D, that the guys from Photons2Photos, if they finally do the work, and the camera just came to market this year, so we'll give them some time, but I'm pretty sure that the chart for the Mark II, for the Hasselblad X2D II, will look kind of the same in terms of shape. And if that is the case, and we have, as I just outlined here, a low gain path and a high gain path, then of course, the behavior of the flash intensity as a function of the parameters in the light triangle dramatically changes if you switch from an ISO 50, which is the low gain path, to an ISO of 400, which is the high gain path. And that clearly is what we observe here. So if we want to interpret this, We see on the left-hand side table, shutter speed affects ambient light only. I come back to this point in a moment, not the flash exposure, but I repeatedly refer to it already. And on the right-hand side, we see how TTL quickly reweights towards flash dominance, and we see a very sharp power jump between 4.1 intensity and 1.8 intensity. Then it slows down and fine-tunes and ends up at the intensity floor, which we discussed before, 0.5. And on the left-hand side, we are in low-gain territory. At ISO 50, the TTL logic stayed entirely in the ambient forward zone. So shutter changes don't disturb the flash-to-ambient ratio. In low-gain mode, the X2D II values highlight latitude, and the TTL algorithm leans on ambient light. On the right-hand side, we are in high-gain territory. And 1/10 of a second starts right at the balance threshold, the first step across it, so TTL flips weighting to the flash forward regime. And that's why we see this sharp jump from 4.1 to 1.8 in intensity. In high gain mode, the X2D II's clean shadow behavior lets flash confidently take over control. And that is what we see here. And I think if we summarize this, the different role of shutter speed observed in these two scenarios comes from the X2D II's dual gain design when it comes to the sensor, which shows different TTL behavior in low gain versus high gain modes. And it's really eye-catching in the live experiment we conducted earlier in the video, how differently the TTL algorithm in the Hasselblad X2D II reacted at base ISO of 50 and totally different at an ISO of 400. Now, let me also talk about the time of influence aspect of what we see in the TTL logic, and that's just an illustration here. But think about the following. We have here three shutter speeds, 1/10 seconds, 1/5 seconds, which equals 0.2 seconds, and then another full stop longer is 0.4 seconds. And the pre-flash happens before taking exposure. That's here marked in orange, right at the left-hand side of these exposure time intervals. And then at the beginning of exposure, which we also repeatedly discussed based on the settings in the flash menu of the camera, the flash kicks in and then exposure is taken. And what this clearly shows is that the flash pulse from the pre-flash and also from the main flash, which happens, as I said, at the beginning of the exposure time, these flash pulses, they are extremely short compared to the exposure time we have the shutter open here. And in contrast to that, the aperture is always there. If we dial in the aperture, let's say in f4 or an f11 or an f16, it's always there. And the same applies to the ISO. You know, if you switch from the base ISO of 50 to an ISO of 400, that is an amplification of everything that hits the sensor in terms of light. So in other words, the flash pulse is much shorter than the exposure time, means our shutter speeds regulate only ambient light photons and not flash photons. In order to regulate flash photons, the proportions between the exposure time and the flash pulse time should be more balanced. That's not what we have here. Of course, if we would dial in super fast shutter speeds, the situation could potentially change. The aperture, in contrast, as let's call it an area opening into the lens, regulates both flash photons and ambient light photons. And ISO, as dialed in sensitivity, affects also flash photons and ambient light photons and amplifies both in an equal way. And that's why there is a big difference how our intensity reacted to changes in shutter speed compared to changes in aperture and ISO. On ISO, we saw an almost textbook-like perfect linear reaction of the flash intensity to ISO changes. And if I summarize these insights in the context of the light triangle, we have the following. We have three parameters in the light triangle. We have ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And for ISO, we talk about sensor-related signal amplification. It multiplies all photons going into the lens. It affects ambient and flash equally. And the TTL logic, as implemented in the camera, reacts always to balance the total exposure. And ISO amplifies both ambient and flash. On the aperture, we have basically a physical photon gateway into the lens. And through the lens, the TTL metering happens. That's why TTL means through the lens. And the wider open we have the lens, the more increase we see to ambient photon flow and flash photon flow simultaneously. And the TTL logic as implemented in the camera reacts because total exposure changes even if flash to ambient ratio stays constant. And we have here an optical control that increases or decreases both ambient light and flash pulse light. And then we have the big difference to shutter speed, because shutter speed is time driven. And exposure time typically is significantly longer than the flash pulse interval. And it does not regulate flash photons, only ambient light photons. And at base ISO, you could think about shutter speed as an ambient only lever, which is exactly what we've observed in our experiments before. All right, so the upper left-hand side table can also drop off because I think I explained in detail now why we saw what we saw. So we have two tables remaining here, and I want to pick this one now, and we'll go through it fairly quickly in the same way as I will go fairly quickly through the last one, because I think we have laid out the foundation we need to understand what's going on here. So for this table, I headlined it now and say Hasselblad's TTL logic under the dual conversion gain sensor assumption, which is something we discussed before. And you see we have here an ISO 400. So in the new nomenclature, we are in a high gain path, and we are at an aperture of f11. And we see here, if we make the shutter speed double as fast from step to step, we see the flash intensity increasing. And first of all, that we see a reaction at all is due to the fact that we are in high gain path here. We just discussed that. And we have this observation that the first step from 1/10 seconds to 1/20 seconds gives us the biggest jump in the flash intensity, and then it slows down and saturates to 4.8, 4.9 and kind of flattens out. And how do we interpret this now after everything we've discussed? Well, shorter shutter speeds cut the ambient light, but the flash pulse itself stays constant in duration. And by the way, the flash pulse interval, as we just discussed, is much, much shorter. The TTL system isn't reacting to flash physics. It's protecting the overall flash to ambient ratio here it wants to maintain. At 1/10 seconds, the ambient light still contributed enough to dominate the scene, moving to 1/20 seconds, half the ambient exposure and crossing the camera's internal balance point, where flash and ambient swap roles. And TTL instantly reweighted toward flash dominance, boosting output sharply once, then only fine-tuning further as the flash to ambient ratio stabilized. That's in a nutshell what we see here, and in the light of everything we discussed before, I think it makes perfectly sense. And finally, last but not least, the last table here where we made the aperture consecutively wider from f11 to f8 to f5.6 to f4, always one full stop. And the observation is the flash power drops from 4.1 to the floor intensity of 0.5, as we called it before, as the lens opens, and then stays at this intensity floor of 0.5. And interpretation is now straightforward, a wider aperture in the way as we described it just before in the light triangle. A wider aperture brightens both ambient and flash, so TTL reduces flash output. That's just a logical consequence of everything we discussed so far. The floor at flash intensity 0.5, again, as we said before, is the camera imposed TTL command floor, the lowest flash power the X2D II will ever request in TTL mode. It doesn't go lower, although the Profoto A2 internally in its hardware can go lower to 0.1, but the Hasselblad will never ask it to do, because it stops sending weaker power commands once the pre-flash data becomes unreliable. And in conclusion, opening up the aperture steadily increases both ambient and flash exposure. Again, remember the light triangle I showed you before. So the X2D Mark II's TTL algorithm pulls flash intensity back until it reaches the camera imposed floor at 0.5. And with this, I have explained everything I showed experimentally before. And I hope the explanations, the mathematics around it, the reasoning makes also sense to you, as it makes sense to me. And now the big question, of course, is how was it shooting Stephanie with the Profoto A2 Flash? And that's clearly what I want to show you next. All right, you got a bit of a flavor from my live shooting with Stephanie in the last couple of clips. And now I want to show you some sample images. And first of all, I really love natural light. I'm not a big fan of flash exposure, but here in this camera lens flash combination, exposure comes across really, really nice. I was super surprised when looking into the images, how they came across, saw them already in live view, of course, in the camera, in the preview mode. And this is really, really cool. And what, of course, plays out here, all its strength is the new autofocus continuous mode on a Hasselblad X2D II and the eye and face detection in combination. Just beautiful. And what I also in particular like and want to point out here is the very natural look of her skin, the skin tone, the structure of her skin. I applied here a minimum of post-processing. And these images, they look really good. Finally, flash exposure that doesn't look like overly harsh flash exposure. And I think this is really beautiful what we have here. Let me go to one image I wanted to show in particular, namely this one here, because here I can show you how fantastic the eye autofocus of the Hasselblad X2D II now works. And by the way, I always get questions, is it worthwhile to upgrade from an X2D to an X2D II? And my answer is very simple and straightforward. If you are a landscape photographer, there is not really a need to upgrade. If you are in people photography, yes, of course, you should upgrade and spend the money because this is a real game changer. Look at that here. So the hair in the foreground here is blurry. The eye in the background is pinpoint sharp nailed. And this is the left-hand side eye. The right-hand side eye already is a little bit blurry because I'm shooting here at 100mm in the tailor setting, widest open f4.0 at this tailor setting. And look how sharp and crisp her eye is nailed here by the focus. And the hair in the foreground is blurry. This is something we typically know from sports cameras, from Sony, Canon, Nikon, you know, what have you. And this works here in absolutely fabulous ways. Let's go to this one here. That's a nice one because Stephanie's smiling. And also here, look at the skin tone, the contrast, micro contrast, the structure of her skin and the way the eye is nailed here with that eye detection, face detection, and in the autofocus continuous mode. So this is really cool. One last image. I don't want to overdo it here. And again, a beautiful image of Stephanie cropping in to 100%, 101.9 megapixel. Absolutely beautiful. And for me, that concludes the video. I hope you liked it. And maybe one last remark. It is indeed not straightforward shooting flash with Hasselblad X and also Hasselblad V cameras. But once you understand it, once you start to understand how the camera connects with the flash and steers the intensity, you can use it and get really beautiful exposures out of it. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel. There's always more to come. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and healthy. And of course, peace out.